The sun was rising over the wilderness of Canaan, painting the horizon in gold and dust. Israel was preparing to enter the Promised Land, a new beginning after years of wandering. But for 5 women, that new beginning came with a question no one had dared to ask before. Their names were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milkah, and Tirzah, the daughters of a man named Zelophehad. He had died during the journey through the desert, one of many who didn't make it to the land God promised. He wasn't part of any rebellion or wrongdoing. He simply died a natural death. But he left behind no sons, only daughters. And that was the problem. In those days, land inheritance passed only through sons. That meant when the Israelites divided up the land, Zelophehad's name, his memory, his legacy would disappear, and his daughters would be left with nothing. No land, no name to carry, no place to call their own. But these women weren't the type to quietly accept that fate. They had grown up watching Moses lead their people, watching God provide manna from heaven, part seas, and speak from fire. They knew he was just, that he cared for every life, not just the lives of men. So one day, as the leaders gathered, the daughters of Zelophehad stood up. Imagine that moment, 5 women standing before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the tribal chiefs, and the entire community. It must have been intimidating. The crowd probably fell silent, all eyes on them. Then with courage steadying their voices, they spoke. "Our father died in the wilderness," they said. "He had no sons. Why should his name disappear from his clan just because he had daughters? Give us property among our father's relatives." It was a bold request, not defiant, but brave. They weren't asking out of greed, but out of love. Love for their father's name, love for justice, love for belonging. Moses listened. He didn't dismiss them. He didn't tell them to sit down or stay quiet. Instead, he took their case straight to God. And God answered. "The daughters of Zelophehad are right," the Lord said. "You must certainly give them property as an inheritance among their father's relatives and turn their father's inheritance over to them." Just like that, history shifted. For the first time, women were recognized in Israel's inheritance laws. God established a new rule. If a man dies with no sons, his inheritance goes to his daughters. It was a victory not just for those 5 women, but for generations of women to come. Imagine the joy in their camp that day, the relief, the tears, the pride. The daughters of Zelophehad had stood before leaders and before God himself, and they had been heard. But their story didn't end there. Years later, when the Israelites finally stood at the edge of the Promised Land, those same daughters showed up again. They reminded Joshua and the leaders of what the Lord had said, and they received their inheritance in the land of Canaan, just as God had promised. 5 women, no armies, no wealth, no titles, just faith and courage. It's one of those quiet stories in Scripture that's easy to overlook. No battles, no miracles of fire or water, but in its own way, it was a miracle. Because God showed that he listens, that he values fairness, that his promises are not limited by gender, culture, or tradition. Sometimes courage doesn't look like slaying giants or crossing seas. Sometimes it looks like standing in front of authority with trembling hands, asking for what's right, and trusting God with the outcome. The daughters of Zelophehad remind us that faith can speak respectfully, yet boldly. They remind us that God sees what's fair, even when the world doesn't. And they remind us that sometimes change begins with a few voices willing to stand up and say, "This isn't right." Their story echoes through time, through every person who's ever had to speak up, not to demand power, but to defend truth. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or overlooked, remember these daughters. They weren't powerful, they weren't influential, but their courage and faith rewrote part of Israel's law forever, because when faith speaks honestly, God listens. Thank you for listening to the story of the daughters of Zelophehad. If this story touched you, Share it with someone who needs a reminder that God still sees, still listens, and still brings justice, even through quiet, courageous voices.